thank you, Marianne, and thank you all for coming. And I know 610 was crazy today and horrible traffic, but thank you very much for making the effort. And I think this is really kind of what the council is about, a better informed citizenry. And you're one of the very few people that have won the Pulitzer Prize twice. Most people are happy to even be nominated for it. And I think part of the reason you have such an incredible reputation is you do incredible work, great at finding sources, getting information, but putting it all together in a way that's very readable. This book reads like a novel, except if it was a novel, it'd be a kind of crazy one, except it's real. But you also, I think, put it out there in a manner that the public can really take some deep lessons from it. Before we get into the heart of the book, this is looking back at the United States' convoluted and often difficult relationship with a brutal dictator, really for the better part of 20 years. But where we are today, what are the lessons hopefully we as a country, as a people, but especially in terms of administrations? You're very critical of both Republican and Democrat administrations in this book where they've made mistakes. But in terms of what do you think we should take from this to hopefully not again make a kind of a rash or kind of ill-informed decision to go to war against a dictator that we probably don't know enough about. We may not have people in the inner circles, as with Saddam, as we probably don't really know very well the kind of the inner workings of President Xi's regime, if he was to do something in Taiwan. Similarly, North Korea, the Kim regime has always been one of the hardest ones to get intelligence assets inside. What do you think this book should give the American people and American presidents in terms of a warning of being absolutely certain, not just of what the situation is, but if you do something, what the results will be?
Well, I mean, it's an important question. It's a big one. I would say, so the story of this book is about how the war originated, taking into account Saddam's side of the equation, right? So the idea was not to go relitigate our decision-making between 2001 and 2003, but to enlarge our understanding of the origins of the war by taking advantage of these tape recordings that Saddam left behind and the extensive records of his regime that show what he was thinking and saying at pivotal moments of the conflict that he had with the United States. Famously, the invasion of Kuwait, the war that followed, then the long struggle over disarmament in the 1990s, then 9/11, and finally to the invasion in 2003. So that's the story, and it tries to rewrite our understanding, taking advantage of these records. So the first thing to say is that the book is a kind of a case study, a very rare case study of how a dictator in a very closed system thinks and behaves in response to the United States over the course of a diverse conflict. And the records themselves are part of the answer as to what we should really study this case, because it's rare to have something so well documented, to be able to listen to an adversary who obviously befuddled us considering what unfolded. And so that's where I would start. I think there are, I'm not a policy practitioner. I'm a historian, an investigative journalist. I try to bring forward a record that other people can interpret, and I do offer judgments and analysis, but not a single point of view. But I have found that question that you asked is part of bringing a book like this forward. And what's interesting about it is that as a writer, you have permission to empathize with a monstrous figure like Saddam Hussein. Like you don't have to sanitize him. I haven't sanitized him. I think if you read the book, you'll see shockingly how brutal he could be. But I still have tried to get behind his eyeballs and see the world from his perspective. That's the only way I could explain what he was saying and thinking at all these moments where he confounded us. And even as I do that exercise of empathy, which a writer must undertake to be effective, I feel aware that a president would have trouble doing that. Because first of all, our competitive domestic politics doesn't allow you to think out loud about an adversary that way in public. And there's so much penalty. There's a moment in the book where Bill Clinton is talking to Tony Blair in 1998, and he says, have you guys, you Brits, have you ever talked to Saddam since like 1991? Is anybody in your ministries in touch with his people? And Blair, who's new in office, he says, I don't think so. I can check. And Clinton says, because I would, if I could, I would pick up the phone and call the son of a bitch. But I feel like it's such a fraught subject in this country that if I did that, I would be so hammered that it wouldn't be worth it. And so, now, am I saying that the answer to your question is that we need to understand Vladimir Putin more fully? We need to fully grasp his motivations. I'm not saying that empathy is the answer to successful foreign policy or national security. It's just not. But the absence of it is probably regrettable, because I do feel confident that even when we go back over the record leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, that we will, if Vladimir Putin, as I hope he has been doing, has been tape recording his leadership conversations, that we will learn with humility how much we didn't understand. So a second lesson is humility. You really have to recognize that, especially when you're dealing with someone that you don't talk to, who lives in a closed system, in a culture that is not yours, that their assumptions, their logic is not going to be yours, and that you may not even be able to get to the beginning of the thought process that leads them to the decisions that they make. So then the final point, and this is, in the end, the opposite of saying try to understand a little bit more, have some humility about what you are likely not going to be able to understand, which is, so then how do you protect your interests? How do you protect the country? How do you protect the safety of the American people? I mean, I walked away from this thinking it's a paradox. On the one hand, we missed the fact that Saddam didn't have WMD because we didn't really understand who he was and why he was behaving the way he did. That's clear if you go back and look at the record and look at the narrative that's in this book. At the same time, he was so erratic, so aggressive, he invaded two countries without provocation, Iran and Kuwait, that you wouldn't have wanted to bet your security on trying to predict his intentions. So probably better to go back to the classic of international relations, which is to focus on your adversary's capabilities rather than their intentions, and to send clear deterrence messages. If you don't want them to do something, to try to send a credible deterrence message so that they will think twice before they do it. We didn't even do that with Saddam. We didn't get deterrence right with him all the time. George H.W. Bush did at a critical moment, but there was another critical moment where he didn't. It's hard work, but I think that's the essence of it.
And lastly, for the kind of longer, broader, not just regional, really global impacts, especially upon U.S. foreign policy and our reputation, a lot of people have discussed, obviously, the country that benefited the most by this is Iran. It was already a disruptive player across much Middle East, much more disruptive now, arguably, than it was before. You can also kind of argue very easily that instead of defeating terrorism or a possible indirect terrorist threat, you made Iraq less stable. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually becomes ISIS, emerges, so that terrorism kind of flowers and explodes from there. But maybe you can talk about, in kind of the bigger kind of ideological sense, what it means for America's reputation, especially with countries we're trying to work with, in terms of what it meant in terms of U.S. credibility, that we got this so wrong on WMDs in Iraq, so that especially so many Middle East countries are less likely to say we could definitively count on or trust what the U.S. is telling us. And then maybe in the bigger sense, and you mentioned Vladimir Putin, what does it mean in terms of preemptive war? It's always a difficult and hard subject. Vladimir Putin and others who support him would say the United States invaded Iraq when he was contained, when he was not a military threat, because they were worried about the long-term threat of Iraq. We invaded Ukraine because we were worried that if NATO was left to mess about in Ukraine too much longer, we would get attacked. You can say it's debatable or not, but what are the legacies of kind of American credibility and a preemptive war?
Well, I mean, the question about credibility is interesting because it touches on a theme about the way Saddam looked at his relationship with the United States through a lens that we just didn't recognize or understand. So one of the reasons why he didn't cooperate with the UN inspection regimes that made him look so guilty and led the Bush administration and the Blair government and others to say he definitely has weapons of mass destruction, he's lying. One of the reasons he behaved so uncooperatively was that he thought that the CIA knew that he had secretly destroyed all of his weapons because they know everything. And so, since they know that I secretly destroyed all my weapons, the fact that they're accusing me of still having them is just a game. It's just a pretense to invade and knock me off. And by the way, I've noticed that American leaders have been saying since Madeleine Albright's speech in 1997 that regime change is the American policy. So why should I play their game? Why should I cooperate? It's all just a ruse. That was his thinking. Honesty doesn't pay. Now, was that, you say we lost credibility because the world saw that we made a mistake, an analytical mistake, by judging that he had weapons he didn't possess. Does the world think we made an analytical mistake? Or does the world think we just invented a WMD story in order to invade a country that we wanted to knock off anyway? How many Americans believe that? Mm-hmm. I've been already since this is my first week of talking about the book. I've been kind of surprised at the variety of people who say to me, but didn't we just lie about why are you saying that we were surprised that he didn't have the weapons? Didn't we know that he didn't have the weapons and we just made up the story and went in? Now, I know that's not true, but I recognize that a great deal of right-thinking people believe it is true. So, and not just in this country, but all over the world. So I think credibility in this era is a complicated question when it comes to sort of these kinds of traumatic departures from the norms. Now, preemptive war is another subject I think we could spend a lot of time on it. I think the only thing I would say is that I think what the United States discovered in Afghanistan and in Iraq after the shock of 9/11, a shock to the system that changed our attitude about risk management for reasons that I think everyone who lived through 9/11 can understand why it was a shock, even if we can see in retrospect that we didn't react to the shock with as much wisdom as we might have. That the world of expeditionary, aggressive warfare is not the same as it was in 1950 or 1920 or 1880. You're living in a fishbowl of hyper-connected global citizenry, and every move you make generates a reaction in real time. And there was a Central Command commander of Lebanese origin, an American, first Arab American to command all of the U.S. forces in the Middle East, General Abizaid. And his point in kind of cautioning about the plan in Iraq was, you got to understand there's a clock ticking. You can go in 60 days and knock off Saddam Hussein and get out of there, and you'll probably get away with it. You may leave chaos behind, but after 60 days, you're asking for it. In this hyper-connected world, people are going to make use of your presence, of your claims to legitimacy. They're going to challenge you, and we didn't plan for a lot of things, but I also think conceptually we didn't understand what the consequences of our integrated, hyper-connected, media-saturated, asymmetric world really are for the conventional use of forces across borders. And I think war is going to continue to change very rapidly now, and you can see Ukraine is modeling a lot of changes in the nature of warfare. But one thing that Ukraine is showing is that things are even more speeded up and more intensely connected than they were during the wars that we fought in Afghanistan and Iraq.
And we'll bring it back, obviously, to the crux of the book is really, in a lot of ways, this book is unique. You sued the Pentagon for access to thousands of documents. Also, you mentioned the hours of video, of audio, of the tape, kind of like Nixon that Saddam had of his high-level meetings. So it's an excellent job of presenting, which so many people don't know, is the Iraqi side of it. Why did Saddam do this? But before we get more into that, can you discuss why, I believe in the acknowledgments, you mentioned you thought about starting the book with the first Gulf War, and one of the former State Department intelligence experts who later worked for the UN Commission for Disarmament, Charles Dwelfer, I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
He had said, no, Steve, you really need to start where this relationship starts. Start 10 years earlier, start with the Reagan administration, and can you talk about those steps in the early years of the Reagan administration, and especially how in the world we got to Iran-Contra, and what were the kind of the big results and kind of blowback from that?
Right. So Saddam became president of Iraq in 1979. He had really been the power behind the throne even before that, but that was when he took full power. And what else happened in 1979? Iranian Revolution, right? So Ayatollah Khomeini comes to power, huge pivot in our position in that part of the Middle East because our ally, the Shah, is overthrown and replaced by a hostile expansionist religious revolution. And Saddam was as threatened by the Iranian Revolution as we were, maybe more so because he was right next door. And Ayatollah Khomeini pledged fairly early on, I'm going to get rid of that secular nationalist. I'm going to hang him from the nearest light pole. As you may know, Saddam belonged to the Sunni tradition of the Islamic faith, but the great majority of Iraqis were Shia, like Iran's majority. And so Khomeini saw an opportunity to extend this Shia revolutionary vision that he had brought to power in Tehran right into Baghdad. Now, Saddam misunderstood the Iranian Revolution. He thought they were vulnerable, so he, unprovoked, he invaded Iran, thinking that he could knock Khomeini off before he could consolidate power and threaten him. That was a terrible miscalculation. He started a war that bogged down into a stalemate. 1 million people lost their lives as a result of it. After that war started, the Reagan administration was monitoring it, and in 1982, they had a panic because they could see from their satellite photography that the Iranians were on the verge of breaking through Iraqi lines, breaking out of this World War I kind of stalemate that had developed, and maybe driving right through to Baghdad and fulfilling Khomeini's pledge to expand Iranian power right through Iraq. So they sent a CIA officer, a guy named Thomas Twetton, who eventually ran the whole Directorate of Operations, into Baghdad on a private jet that King Hussein of Jordan provided him. And he was carrying a lot of satellite photography that showed the Iranian positions. He got an audience with Saddam's people. They weren't really sure whether to trust the pictures, but the military then checked them out and said, yeah, that's actually very helpful. Thank you. And Twetton said there's more where that came from. And there embarked this secret collaboration between the CIA, for most of it, the Defense Intelligence Agency later, to provide Iraq with an advantage for the purpose of having them avoid losing the war. That was all they wanted. They weren't trying to help him win the war so much. They were just trying to make sure he didn't lose the war. And he needed this satellite photography, or he certainly wanted it. But all along, Saddam, who, from our earlier remarks, we remember, believes that the U.S. is, the CIA is omniscient, and also believes they're completely untrustworthy. There's always a conspiracy within a conspiracy. These photographs are not what they seem to be, comrades, he would say over and over again. The generals would say that you may be right, dear leader, but the units they depict really are on the other side of that hill. Like, I know because they shot at me, so I'm going to go attack them. So please keep this stuff coming. But he kept saying there's something else going on here. His first suspicion was that the U.S. was providing the same pictures to the Iranians for the strategic purpose of fomenting a stalemate. Later, he started to collect intelligence that the Iranians were receiving spare parts and maybe even weapons from Israel, and he assumed that the Americans had to know about that. So now there was some evidence that this double game was real. But the Americans assured him throughout, no such thing is happening. Absolutely not. We're on your side. We mean what we say. And then, in November 1986, you remember turning on your television, seeing our then Attorney General Edwin Meese stand in front of a microphone at the Justice Department and announce what became known as the Iran-Contra scandal. And what was its content? It was that the Reagan administration, in order to attempt to free hostages that were being held by Iranian proxies in Lebanon, had accepted Israeli advice to secretly supply Iran with weapons to fight against Iraq, including anti-tank missiles that were very sophisticated. It turns out they also gave the Iranians a bunch of intelligence about the Iraqi order of battle. A lot of that is still classified, and I still don't know quite what the cache of materials they gave was, but apparently it was quite extensive. All right, when this was revealed, around the world, leaders were shocked, stunned that the United States would have done this. Who was the least surprised leader in the entire planet? There's a tape of him the morning after President Reagan kind of goes out and apologizes for this. He said, my intentions were good. I was trying to free hostages. And Saddam is with his comrades, and he said, basically, I told you so. How many times do I have to tell you? And what's important about it, to the course of events later, is that the tapes show in the 90s, so, we got over Iran-Contra, we had, felled a lot of trees, printed a lot of investigative reports, there were criminal prosecutions of people involved, and then we moved on. But in the mid-90s, when he was again in conflict with the United States over disarmament and the status of his WMD, in the tapes, when his people are telling him, well, maybe you should cooperate with the Americans, maybe you should turn left, turn right, he says, but remember, the things that were revealed in 1986, they're all still going on. This hasn't changed. And so he believed that there was a permanent collaboration between the United States, Israel, and Ayatollah Khomeini, the purpose of which was to defeat him. And as crazy as that may sound, Iran-Contra kind of was that. Yeah. And the idea that it was a mistake, that it was kind of harebrained, however well-intentioned, and that was one of those things that we do from time to time that you just kind of look back on and say, what were they thinking? The idea that America was capable of that sort of error, it just wasn't part of his worldview. No, it was all part of a deep structure that was continuously going on. And so it shaped his behavior. He wouldn't cooperate with us. He wouldn't see American policy at face value because he believed that there was this underlying, essentially, alliance between the U.S., Israel, and the Iranian revolutionary regime.
So obviously he was distrustful of the U.S. before, of the CIA, what the real intentions were. He was an extreme anti-Semite. He thought the U.S., everything was based upon them supporting the Zionists in Israel. That was a framework he looked at the world. But in terms of others in the region, this also was another reason for even some of our allies to doubt that we're giving them the truth, that you are cooperating with Iran. And to move on to the first Gulf War, your book goes through it all wonderfully, and a lot of people see that, and most people would agree, it is a foreign policy success for the United States, one of the most significant ones of the last maybe 20, 30 years. But the big question is, what came after the war? Your book kind of dispels the fact that the idea of regime change was not discussed at length within the Bush 41 administration, but maybe what was indirectly an impact, especially upon the Iraqi people, that 10 years later would not trust the Americans, is that the Bush and the administration had publicly encouraged the Iraqis to rise up against Saddam, especially the Kurds, especially the Shia in the south. They did rise up. They were viciously and brutally put down. The U.S. gave them no support. And so then even most of the Iraqi people don't trust the United States. What are the lessons from the first Gulf War that really bled over to the Iraq invasion?
Well, I think you've answered the question. There was no faith among the Iraqi population in U.S. intentions. partly because of the events of early 1991 when, as you say, we called for an uprising, one took place, and then we did nothing, and it was brutally suppressed. I think, that basic story is probably familiar to those of you like me who remember living through the events. What was interesting in the research, because I tried to take advantage of the passage of time to find new materials about every one of these episodes, in addition to the Saddam tapes and the records from his regime. And I was able to access records about what actually happened when Saddam cracked down on this uprising that have not been made public, that were essentially accumulated for a war crimes prosecution, some of which actually did take place in Iraq. But they're testimonies of survivors of the crackdown, and descriptions of what Saddam's forces did in the south, particularly. I mean, in Kurdistan, when they counterattacked, the Kurds moved north, and we ultimately created a safe haven. It was terrible suffering, and many people lost their lives. But in the south, we stood by without necessarily even knowing what Saddam's forces were doing, and the Iraqi people who had bought into this idea that their moment had come to take sovereign power away from Saddam's regime paid an unimaginable price in brutal retaliation. I mean, tens of thousands of people killed, thrown out of hospital windows, all kinds of terrible things. And the collective memory of that experience. I mean, look, the Iraqi people didn't rise up because George H.W. Bush told them they should. They rose up because they wanted to overthrow Saddam, and they were immiserated by the war he had started unnecessarily in Kuwait. But they were encouraged to believe that outside support would come in, and it didn't, and they never forgot. And so when we came in pledging liberation, they had skepticism informed by that experience.
And getting to that interwar period, about 12 years between the first Gulf War and the invasion in 2003, your book presents it, wonderfully, and can you help the audience understand? And I highly recommend any of you want to know more about this period in Iraqi history and of course American history. What actually happened to the Iraqi chemical, biological, and nuclear programs, which they did have? Obviously, they killed thousands of Kurds and Iranians before with chemical weapons. What happened, and maybe in particular, maybe you could discuss the manner and the haste in which they disposed of those programs were part of what created this enduring, controversy and an impossible, answer for them to give to the world.
Well, it's such a strange thing that actually happened. I mean, and even I didn't appreciate how strange it was, and I thought I understood roughly what had happened. You all remember, we believed, our intelligence community assured the president and the cabinet in 2003 that Saddam probably still had chemical weapon stocks, that he probably still had biological weapons, and maybe actively was producing them, and that there was a pretty good chance that he had reconstituted his nuclear weapons program. Okay, so that was what we believed in 2003. Then we went in and they weren't there. So what happened, right? Because he did have them. The book opens with the Robert Oppenheimer of Iraq basically entering into building a nuclear weapon in 1979. They had a 10-year program that we didn't know anything about. They gassed the Iranians in plain sight over and over again with mustard gas and sarin during the 1980s. They gassed their own people, rebellious Kurds, again. And less was known about their biological weapons program, but they did have one, and it was robust, and they even deployed weapons on the eve of the Gulf War. They didn't use them. What happened was, after Saddam was expelled from Kuwait, the UN, in unity, passed this disarmament resolution insisting that Saddam verifiably surrender all of his chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons, and any means to make them ever again, as well as missiles with a certain range that could deliver them. And this was enforceable by inspection, that the international community would come in and if he didn't cooperate, then we would go back to war with him. So he was exhausted and defeated after the invasion of Kuwait, and he wanted to get out from under the sanctions that had been imposed on Iraq as soon as he invaded Kuwait. So he wanted to pass these inspections. So he told his son-in-law, and basically only his son-in-law knew what was going on, destroy everything, get rid of all of the chemical and biological weapons, and blow up all the bad missiles that we're not supposed to have. And so in the dark of night, they went out into the desert with various scientists who were associated with these programs, and they literally dumped the stuff into the sand. They didn't keep any records. They didn't keep any inventory. They didn't take any photographs. They just got rid of it. And he didn't tell anybody what he had done, basically. And he also lied about the history of the programs when the inspectors came. The book follows this Robert Oppenheimer character. He's an amazing figure in our history. And he had all of Saddam's people come to his door in the middle of the night saying, you got to get rid of these massive magnets that you've been using to secretly enrich uranium because the inspectors are coming next week. And he's like, they're very heavy. I cannot get rid of them. And they had to get these giant trucks and try to drive them across the desert. The inspectors kind of caught them, ran up with cameras. I mean, the whole thing was insane, but it was like the Keystone Cops. But it was so transparently deceptive that the inspectors naturally assumed that he hadn't actually destroyed anything, that it was just a game to hide things, that things were being hidden. And that stimulated 10 years of cat and mouse looking for things. And then the misunderstandings got worse because when the inspectors would go to look in the hiding places, Saddam's bodyguards would try to stop them not because there was anything there, but because they were afraid that they were going to steal presidential records or that they were plotting to assassinate the president and they were trying to defend him. We interpreted that as just evidence that they were hiding the weapons that we were looking for. And this just intensified it. It was mirrors within mirrors. You go back to the original question, why the heck did he do that? Why did he dump everything into the sand and then not keep any records, and then lie to everyone about it for 4 years? Hard to explain, but in his thinking, what he wanted was to pass inspections. He wanted to test whether he would actually ever be able to get out of sanctions by passing the inspections. What he didn't want to have happen was the inspectors come in and immediately find stuff and say, you're in jail. So he said, let's pass inspections by getting rid of everything they're looking for. But he didn't anticipate the inspectors would say, yeah, not only do we want to find where the weapons are, we want to know what the history is. We want to know, how many did you have? And what are the records that they're gone? Show us the inventory. And of course, they couldn't answer those questions because the people who ran the programs didn't even know what the son-in-law had done. And then some of them were afraid to tell the truth, and others were ordered to lie, and this went on for years and years. So he was partly trying to pass inspections. He was also, I think the tapes really make clear, his honor, his pride would not allow him to be humiliated in public. He wasn't going to take the big arsenal that he had created for modernized Iraq and have a bunch of Westerners in white coats sit around with clipboards while he destroyed it in front of the whole world. He also thought that would make him vulnerable to attack. That the Iranians would attack him, the Israelis would attack him, and his own generals might move against him if they thought he was so weak as to make a display of his own disarmament. So those were as best as I can determine, those were the reasons he did this crazy thing. But you can see why it confused everybody, and it did confuse everybody for the next 12 years.
And just to highlight it, you mentioned he was going to kind of do what he could to pass the UN inspections, knew that would be problematic, but also obviously worried about external threats, the Iranians in particular. You talked about his own inner circle. He had been involved in assassination attempts when he was younger himself, and eventually rose to power in his own kind of brutal ways. There's a kind of crazy few lines in the book. I think he's talking to one of his lieutenants, Chemical Ali, who asked Saddam in a quiet, closed meeting, do we have weapons of mass destruction? And Saddam says back to him, don't you know? And then his lieutenant says, no. And then Saddam says,
right.
No, but you don't know. he didn't even, the top levels of the Iraqi government didn't even know, and was that because he never wanted to appear weak in front of them? And I mean, what was it, how far did it go in terms of...
He really didn't trust his generals, and he really didn't want them to know what he did and didn't have. He was constantly telling them, as the 2003 war approached, he said, you just hold the Americans off. If they do come, you didn't believe we were going to invade for an awfully long time, but when he was finally starting to get the picture that it might happen, he said, you hold them off for a week or two and then I'll take care of it. The generals thought, okay, so we really do have a nuclear weapon, or something. And then he would also say, we were chatting about this coming from the airport, he would also say to his own senior-most aides, are you sure there aren't any weapons that I don't know about? Because he sort of doubted that his own orders had made it all the way through the bureaucracy, and then maybe somebody thought that he secretly wanted them to be working on it when he really didn't want them to be working on it. So he managed to confuse everybody, including himself.
And leading up, to the war itself, obviously the big intelligence questions. I think you make it clear. You've covered American intelligence, CIA in particular, for better part of 20 years. This book, you interview some of the highest levels and people on the ground across not just the U.S. but allies, intelligence agencies. The intelligence agencies, and the question has always been, the best intelligence services, or when the CIA others, are effective when they gather intelligence and they make an analysis and they pass it on, but they do not make any policy recommendations. They do not inform policy. But in this scenario with the Bush administration, there's always been the critique that policy was informing or slanting or shading the intelligence. Do you think that's a fair assessment, that people within CIA, whether it's groupthink or whatever, kind of felt the Bush administration, Rumsfeld, Wolfowitz, and others had already made this decision long before the war, and they were just looking for intelligence to support it instead of refute it, their position?
I mean, it's really complicated because the files about what the best judgment of what Iraq possessed, WMD-wise, were years and years old. Long before 9/11, the CIA believed, and so did the Brits and even the Germans, and even the UN inspectors could not exonerate Iraq because Iraq couldn't answer all the questions. I mean, the Iraqis lied about their biological weapons program through and through until 1995, so 4 years after they secretly destroyed a lot of their stocks. So no wonder people thought that they were hiding stuff. And so it wasn't as if people twisted or invented the records within the U.S. intelligence system that said that it was probable that Iraq had these weapons. That pre-existed 9/11. In the atmosphere after 9/11 and in the drumbeat of war, there were certainly individuals at CIA who, got caught up in the momentum of it, and maybe in the way that human beings do, decided that, well, I better get on this train, and so maybe they leaned in one direction or another direction. But I don't think anybody invented anything out at the agency, and the agency at least rejected the one charlatan who was feeding invented intelligence into the system, Ahmed Shalaby, who only had takers for his defectors, fake defectors, and false stories at the Defense Department. Because the CIA had issued a burn notice about him earlier. And so no, I don't think that the intelligence reporting amounted to policy advice. I think the critique is the opposite, which was that once the cabinet made a decision to essentially head towards war, I mean, you can look, the president and Condoleezza Rice would say that they were engaged in coercive diplomacy, threatening to go to war in the hope that they could finally tip Saddam into cooperating and disarming verifiably. We now know that was based on a false premise. He wasn't capable of disarming verifiably, no matter how much you tried to coerce him. But that was the theory of the case. And they, at the same time, had to muster public support for the invasion. And as Paul Wolfowitz said later, WMD was the one thing everyone could agree on, so that ended up being in the rhetoric, and we do know that the public statements that were made about the intelligence got ahead of what the intelligence actually said, that, you know, you kind of, 1 and 1 became 3 in some political speeches, particularly around the nuclear weapons program.
My colleagues have those question cards. They're going to pass them up, and you guys have them. But maybe one last thing to touch upon, kind of lessons learned. You touched upon it a bit, but unfortunately, dictators aren't going away. Autocracies are stronger and more threatening in Russia, China, North Korea, and elsewhere than they have been in many years. Two things. In the book, you highlight that the most effective deterrence in this 20-year span was when James Baker, just a few weeks before the war, met with Tariq Aziz in Geneva and said, we realize there's a potential you might try and use chemical weapons against American troops and our allies. If you do, there'll be extreme repercussions, leaving it open for interpretation, meaning, and your regime will no longer exist. But that was peer-to-peer, senior level communication, and that was the last communication between the United States and high-level Iraqis for 12 years until the war. Is that something we are not doing enough of now and we maybe need to do more of? I know you're not an expert on Russia or China. And then obviously the book highlights, you know, some areas where the intelligence community didn't get things right or whatever, but also the one thing throughout the book that's present is whoever it might be, whichever administration, saying we don't have someone on the inside, we don't have assets in Saddam's inner circle, we don't really have a good read on him. Is human intelligence, the CIA in particular, still very crucial, and are we doing enough to support the gathering of human intelligence, especially regimes that are threatening in the world?
Well, so a couple of just quick points. I think the example you gave about James Baker and Tariq Aziz is terribly important because it shows you that even with someone like Saddam, who was demonstrably erratic and aggressive, that deterrence works if it's properly delivered and calibrated to the circumstances. The reason we know it works is because before he said that, before Baker delivered that message, Saddam had deployed chemical weapons to the front lines to give himself the option to gas American troops as they came in. He had even tried to get biological weapons down there. His son-in-law, in a kind of darkly hilarious meeting, has to tell his father-in-law, they're not actually ready to use yet. And he's like, what? So anyway, he had the weapons. There's every reason to think he would have used them, but his reaction to the Baker message was, they are going to nuke us. And he then gets involved in trying to evacuate the population of Baghdad because he thinks nuclear war is coming. And in the end, at the moment of decision, he doesn't use the chemical weapons. And why? Because of this deterrence message. No, I think there's no question about it. There's not a moment on the tapes where you get it exactly stitched up, but I don't think there's any other plausible interpretation. So deterrence works. Then the second point is that we had no contact with him after we evicted him from Kuwait until 2003. And, you know, maybe I have a bias as a journalist. I think you should talk to people. I think you should talk to people even if they're not friendly to you. You should talk to them. You should, even if they seem like they're dangerous. I mean, we go into journalists, we go and we talk to people about why they became serial murderers. I mean, it's doable. Doesn't mean you have to be kind to them or that you're compromising yourself morally, but it's politically complicated, it's sensitive, it's morally uncomfortable. But we can't afford not to have contact with people who threaten to do us harm, I think, in this world for 10 or 12 years. Now, does that mean that Bill Clinton has to pick up the phone and call Saddam Hussein? Absolutely not. I mean, that's what you have intelligence services for. Like, do a back channel. Have some other back channel, or, you know, get as close as you can to people who actually know what's going on to have a dialogue. In the case of Saddam, he was craving for a dialogue through the 90s because he hoped it might help him wiggle out of sanctions. But there were things to talk about. I mean, he was opposed to Islamist terrorism at home and abroad. He wanted to talk about the Middle East peace process, even though he had been a rejectionist. He understood that a lot of people were coming in from the cold and accepting Israel's existence. He was willing to talk about that. We wouldn't authorize any contact with him. Now, if we'd had the contact, would it have made a difference? I don't know, but in the run-up to 2003, he was doing and saying things around his regime, some of which we've just reviewed, that would have caused you to pause and think about your hypothesis that he had WMD. Why? And for one thing, he spent most of the years right up until 2003 writing novels. He was obsessed with novel writing. He had lost interest in military affairs, and his aides couldn't find him for days at a time, and his editors were getting all these handwritten pages of his next novel. Now, if you had come across that fact and really understood how he was spending his days, would you have maybe had a conversation about whether our assumptions about him are maybe need to be updated, that in his 60s is not the same guy as he was in his 40s? I don't know. But I just don't understand why contact wouldn't be something you would seek out.
People ask a similar related question, and you discuss it in the book. You touched upon it a bit at the beginning, but just for people to understand a bit more, Chris asks, President George H.W. Bush decided not to go into Baghdad and take Saddam out. Do you believe that he made the best decision at the time?
Yeah, I have total. I mean, I think it was an entirely defensible decision, and he had put together a 40-nation coalition and a UN resolution that was about expelling Saddam from Kuwait. There was no coalition that was going to follow him to Baghdad. He had made no preparations to occupy Baghdad because the war plans had all been about this objective that the whole world had agreed on. And he had hoped that Saddam would be killed during the war. That had proven to be elusive. He had hoped that a coup might have been organized by his own generals as they saw their own humiliation on the battlefield. That didn't happen either. And so he was left with a choice. Well, am I just going to keep our tanks moving into Baghdad without a plan? And he was, I think, experienced enough to know and knew enough about the history of these things in Iraq in particular to say, no, I'm not going to, it doesn't make sense. So of course, in hindsight, you can second guess it, and obviously he left unfinished business that became relevant after 9/11. But I think it was an entirely correct decision in the context that he made it. In fact, everything about H.W. when I was going through these records, except for his failure to deter Kuwait, the invasion of Kuwait in the first place, which was a really consequential error, but it's kind of forgivable because the reason he didn't understand that Saddam was about to go into Kuwait was twofold. Saddam lied to everybody about what he was doing. He said he was secretly planning to do it. But more importantly for H.W. was that all of his Arab allies who he was talking to, King Hussein, Hosni Mubarak, King Fahd in Saudi Arabia, what you see is this is a working president. He's constantly working the phones. He gets that this is a serious thing, that Saddam is threatening to go into Kuwait. And he's calling up all these people who know Saddam better than he does. And he says, what's going on? Is this going to happen? I'm worried. And they all said, don't worry, George. We got this. We got this. This is a bluff. He's never going to do it. Leave it to us. Leave it to us. And he heard that over and over again for several weeks. And, and he's like, okay, this is what I do. I take the best advice that's available. They're all telling me to stay out of it. It's hard for me to do something unilaterally when they all tell me to get away from it. And it turned out they were all wrong, dead wrong. And afterwards, he's in a conversation, H.W.'s in a conversation, he said, the only people who told me that this was going to happen were the Israelis. Maybe I should have listened to them. But everybody else told me it wasn't going to happen. But otherwise, you see someone whose experience that's relevant for the responsibilities of the office was pretty well matched.
And I'm presuming they might be from our event we had with Yaroslav Trofimov of the Wall Street Journal on Ukraine and Russia. There are about 10 questions in here on Russia and Putin. I'm presuming that's from there because I know we're not talking about Russia. If you had questions about Russia, we might just pass on it. I think that's what it was. The book is mostly about the lead up to the war, but in terms of the aftermath, you're very familiar with it. Can you just discuss different versions of questions people ask? Should Iraq been divided into 3 countries, a Kurdish north, a Sunni center, and a Shia south? How would that have worked? And can you discuss Joel asked, can you discuss the impact of disbanding the Iraqi army, which, became future ISIS leadership, and maybe on top of that, the decision and the impacts of disbanding or forbidding most Ba'ath Party members to be part of the new government?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that was a very consequential error to disband. The Ba'ath Party, was an institution that, like the Communist Party in China, which has a membership well over 1 million, I think it's multiple millions, in the proportion of people who were Ba'ath Party members, it was the only way you could be a teacher in a high school, pretty much. So it didn't, you had to distinguish between those who were responsible for the war crimes the regime had committed and those who had a membership card because it was necessary for their low-level civil service job. And more important than that decision, because the Ba'ath Party as an institution, could have been dissolved and then let the Iraqi people decide whether it wants to be reconstituted as a peaceful party competing for elections. But dissolving the army was a decision that they couldn't take back, and it was hugely consequential. That was exactly what Saddam had been afraid of after the Iran war. Was he had this big standing army that had nowhere to go, and part of the reason he invaded Kuwait was he couldn't figure out how to demobilize them because he didn't have the money to transition them into civilian employment. That was one of the reasons why he was arguing with the Kuwaitis about getting his loans forgiven, and he got so angry that he decided to invade since the Kuwaitis wouldn't cooperate. He needed the finance to demobilize this army safely. Well, he never did it, and it was still sitting there, and he was right to be worried about it because after we demobilized it, a lot of people had no future. They were part of a minority now, having previously ruled the country as a minority, as a Sunni minority. And now they were on the streets. The new dispensation was unfriendly to them. And a lot of the talent that ended up in the insurgency that cost our soldiers so heavily was the military talent from that, non-commissioned officers and captains and majors who knew how to fight a war. And they brought it to us, and it was completely unnecessary.
Just for the sake of time, I'll combine these last two, and also if you want to put any concluding remarks. And again, I highly recommend Steve's incredible book. A lot of you might be familiar with his other books. Obviously, most of them related to American foreign policy, but also very well known for his book on Exxon. These are good ways to leave it.
That's also related to American foreign policy, as I think
yeah, absolutely, definitely. Yeah. And related to Iraq, I will remind you we're hosting General Petraeus on March 26th. So I invite you all to come and hear his perspectives on the war, and he's kind of looking more broadly at the current state of war, or the last, since World War II. And these are two good questions, and one is from a teacher and one is from a student. Teacher Eric Tanner, one of our best and most of all teachers, asked, do you think our intelligence agencies have learned from these mistakes and have started to focus more on understanding our enemies from their point of view? Good question. And then a student, one of his students, Edgar asks, would the United States go to war with Iran if there was evidence of a new or kind of a capable nuclear program, effective nuclear weapon?
So the first one, I think there's been a lot of effort to learn the lessons. There's been a lot of internal study. There's been a lot of teaching of new analysts. There's been new initiatives like red teams that are meant to be deliberately sent off to deal with whatever hard problem the intelligence community is trying to advise the president about, and to see it to deliberately take a completely different perspective about it, and to be safe in doing so. Because part of the danger of, we've all worked in institutions. Groupthink is not a unique problem at the CIA. It's part of institutional life. And if you have a strong leader who's saying, we're all going in this direction, there's a price to pay to say, hey, but actually you're going to go off a cliff if you go that way. And so giving people permission to think freely and differently about hard problems, even if their analysis doesn't end up being accurate or contributing much, just the process of giving people permission to dissent, I think, is one lesson that people have tried to take away. I don't know. Leadership analysis, I don't think, looks very good in the Saddam case. I don't think there was enough information. It was too easy to just from a distance do kind of, armchair psychoanalysis, and none of it really got to the heart of his biography or his outlook. I imagine where we have information about someone like Putin, I imagine the profiles of Putin are probably better informed today than the ones about Saddam. But about Xi Jinping, there's a great podcast on the Economist's site, if you listen to podcasts, called The Prince. It's the most ambitious biography of Xi that I've certainly seen in audio documentary form. And I listened to it, and it's there are some American analysts who contribute to it, and I think the outlines of it are probably there in the leadership profiles. But the mysteries around his political biography and his outlook, should make us humble, because you can just see that he lived in a very closed system with a lot of very closed assumptions. And for us to project onto him how we would behave if we were him is obviously, unsound.
And then just to follow up, I know there's no way to know. The question for the student, if it was proven Iran had, say, a capable, few capable nuclear warheads and the ability to deliver them, which they're two separate things, what do you think the U.S. would do?
Well, I think, Central Command would probably advise against a preemptive war because they couldn't come up with an exit strategy, and they couldn't promise the president that they could preempt the nuclear weapons program, since the Iranians have spent 20 years hardening it and dispersing it. And also, you can't kill the expertise that you acquire when you learn how to make a weapon. That doesn't mean, and nobody wants to go in and try to occupy Iran, or thinks that would be in our interests. But are you willing to trust deterrence? That's the question that President, gets paid the big bucks to consider. And the Israelis already have made up their mind about that. They don't believe that deterrence is adequate in the case of Iran. So the real equation, if they started to break out, would be the triangle of what Israel felt it could do, what it felt it must do, how we responded to that, what Israel asked of us, how we reconciled with their position. Would we force them to go alone, knowing that they probably couldn't accomplish the objective? Would we basically break with them over an argument that they should bear the risk of deterrence failing when we don't have to bear that risk the same way? That's what's going to unfold if the Iranians insist on triggering it. And I think the Iranians know that. And I think the Iranians are sufficiently uncertain about what would happen that you can see they're keeping the lid on. Even now, they're kind of dialing back their uranium enrichment, because there is some threshold that they know triggers this whole cascade, and they kind of don't want that to happen right now.
Again, we have Steve's excellent book outside. We'll have one line to buy it. I know some of you, if you've already bought it, we'll have another line for Steve to sign it. So feel free to jump in either line. And like I said, highly recommend it, whether you get this version or kind of electronic or audio version. And will you all please join me in thanking Steve Coll?
Yeah.
Thank you.
And my last selling comment, as the author is used to, you might not have discerned, it's very funny.
Yes.